Hello and welcome to the world today. With Europe in crisis economically, socially, politically, the importance of Germany as the single most important economic and political power in the European continent becomes even more important. Germany has been in the news recently on many levels. The first was the dramatic decision by the German Chancellor Angela Merkel to take in 1 million refugees from the Syrian war, a decision which shocked the rest of Europe by its generosity on one level, but also created severe tensions within her own party in Germany and within the German political culture as a whole. Germany, since the Second World War, has chosen to stay in the background. After the reunification, this remained the policy of successive German chancellors. They didn't want Germany to assert itself, assert its own power, despite the fact that it is the single most important country in the European Union. Now it has become impossible to maintain that pretense. There is no doubt that Germany dominates the European Union, and there is no doubt that what Germany says matters more than any other state within the European Union. So I'm very glad to have with us in the studio Leandros Fischer, who teaches Middle Eastern history at the University of Marburg. Leandros, welcome.
Thank you for having me on your show, Tarek.
Tell me something. Don't you find it odd, or don't German citizens find it odd, that with Merkel's decision on refugees, it actually put her to the left of the German Social Democratic Party, which has been agitating in an unpleasant fashion against too many refugees being allowed into Germany?
Well, I have no access to the personal thinking of Angela Merkel, but I think there are a lot of misconceptions about her decision, her so-called generous decision to let in refugees. You have to understand that what has kept refugees from countries like Syria, like Iraq, like Afghanistan, from getting into Germany, the UK, was the construction of a so-called Fortress Europe. Mm-hmm. Fortress Europe was basically a German invention, which was engineered by none other than Wolfgang Schäuble when he used to be more concerned with internal matters than financial matters. We know him now as Germany's super Tsar of the economy, but he had another mission a couple of years ago. So the policy of Fortress Europe, together with certain European policies like the Dublin II regulation on asylum, was actually meant to, and I can explain a bit what Dublin II is mostly about. Basically says that people coming from non-EU countries as asylum seekers are obliged to seek asylum in the country of the EU they first landed in. The magnitude of the Syrian crisis made it obvious that this system is obsolete and cannot function the way it did for the rich European North, like Germany or the UK, the way it did a couple of years ago. So it's a very big misconception to think that Angela Merkel was kind of generous and let in refugees to stay. There are some people who think that basically Merkel let in refugees so the refugees can create pressure in the labor market, which will force the unions to accept an exemption from the minimum wage. And no doubt a lot of bosses are eager for that, but I think the refugee crisis for Merkel now is mostly a nuisance. She's seeing her popularity dwindle and other forces to her right emerge.
This is why it doesn't make total sense from her own political point of view to have allowed 1 million refugees in. I mean, you provide reasons for why she did this, but you know, we're not just talking now about xenophobia in Poland or Hungary or Croatia or wherever. We're talking about countries like France and Britain, major states within the European Union till now, who have been incredibly miserly in letting in refugees. So compared to the British and French response to the refugees, the German response to the world at large, for whatever reasons, is very generous. That it's backfiring now, and we have a backlash, of course, reveals the contradictions involved in that approach. I mean, it is a strange phenomenon now that the main organs of European finance capital, the Financial Times, the Economist, and some of their equivalents in other parts of Europe are very strongly in favor of immigration, whereas the mainstream parties are not. Gabriel, the leader of the German SPD, had an extremely reactionary position on this. And that's why I started off by asking you that these parties have merged together in forming a government of the center for so long in Germany that now it's difficult to tell which is which.
Yeah, that is true. I mean, when you talk about the SPD today, it's basically a former shell of its former self. I mean, Gerhard Schröder, who was chancellor from 1998 to 2005, who was the one who introduced the groundbreaking neoliberal reforms that destroyed the welfare state and reformed the labor market, he has destroyed what was used to be the biggest social democratic party apparatus in the world.
So he is essentially, Gabriel, the SPD leader, is effectively an in-house bureaucrat?
Yeah, I mean, opinions may vary on that, but he's certainly not somebody who is able to mount a challenge in his persona against Merkel at any point. Even the so-called left wing within the SPD has taken some very right-wing positions on socio-economic matters, like you know, when it comes to the minimum wage or labor, social security, and all these things. What you are seeing now, we have elections in states like Rheinland-Pfalz, which is a very small state, but it's nevertheless an indicator, where the CDU is talking right. So, and even Merkel, far away from the spotlight, has backtracked on many of the generous things she said on refugees. So there is definitely, I think there is a crisis in the sense that even those in power do not know what they're doing right now. You cannot claim that they are working in the direction of a certain plan. Okay. There are many contingencies, many variables, many decisions, and Merkel is basically just trying to stay on top of the situation, something she's not eager to do. And what is mostly alarming is the rise of the AfD, the so-called...
The alternative for Germany, alternative for Deutschland. This party, in the last reports I read about it, is on 10%.
Yes, even 12%.
12%.
At some, depending on the poll you're
reading. Yeah, so that means that in the next German general elections, they would get how many members of parliament if they stay on 10, 12%?
If they stay on 12%, they can get something like, I don't know exactly the ratio, but something like 70 MPs in the Bundestag.
But that is a huge move to the right, were that to happen.
That is a huge move to the right, but I think it's important neither to underestimate nor overestimate, because the AfD is a very weakly institutionalized party. There's a lot of squabbling, so the 12% can turn into 3% tomorrow.
Okay, but explain, what is this party? How did it come about? What are its roots? What is its social composition?
Well, the AfD was more or less founded in 2013 by a group of thoroughly neoliberal economists, among them Bernd Lucke, who is an economics professor. And he's a liberal, basically, on social issues. Well, at least he claims to be. And their project was basically to give expression to a part of the middle classes in Germany that felt that Merkel and Schäuble's handling of the Eurozone crisis was detrimental to the welfare of the German middle class. You could describe it as a right-wing Eurosceptic party, okay. But it would be too far-fetched to call it a proto-fascist party.
No, because I don't think it is that. But it's certainly a party like the parties, like UKIP in this country, in Britain.
Well, I think now it's evolving to something much worse, because you have to see that the AfD basically was founded by a group of economists. So Lucke, he very consciously played with right-wing themes like anti-feminism or defending the extremely elitist educational system that Germany has. They mobilized a part of the Christian democratic camp who felt that Merkel had become too socially liberal. Okay. So, especially in the East, of course they attracted a lot of neo-fascists or proto-fascists. Lucke tried to scrutinize applications for membership. And when they entered the EU Parliament in the last European elections, they basically said, we do not want to work with somebody like Nigel Farage or Marine Le Pen. They said they saw themselves mostly closer to the British Tories.
Okay.
So, but what Lucke basically did was play with fire, and in the end he got burned because he was basically booed out of the party.
He was booted out of the leadership of the party because he was not right-wing enough.
Well, the themes he was playing with inevitably attracted a lot of unsavory figures.
Yes.
And they started, of course, to organize. And this created a dynamic of its own, which Lucke could not contain anymore. So he fell victim of this process.
And he was replaced by?
He was replaced by Frauke Petri, who is seen as the woman who is basically steering the party to the right.
She's the one who recently said that we should have the German army stationed at the borders, and if the refugees try and cross them, the German army should be given instructions to shoot.
Yes. Yes, what you've seen since July is something on a whole new level. First of all, the AfD has more or less merged with the Islamophobic Pegida movement in the East, the way that Laos in Greece, which was a similar party, when it collapsed, gave birth to Golden Dawn. So it's a very dangerous development.
In terms of its membership, it is attracting people from the mainstream parties?
It's attracting people from the CDU mostly, protest voters. Most of the people who are now openly saying that, they say, I used to vote for CDU for 30 years, but I'm now protesting. I'm going to vote for the AfD, and of course after the so-called Cologne sex attacks that night, something that was very latent in Germany became mainstream overnight. That gave them a huge boost.
Talking briefly about the Cologne attacks, I mean, a number of facts have emerged subsequently, which is that the people who carried out these attacks were not exclusively young Muslims. They were also non-Muslims, Germans. But even if they were exclusively of Muslim origin, the way that this got taken up by tarring the entire community in Germany was in fact quite frightening. And the speed with which it took over the German media on virtually every level. How do you explain this phenomenon, that sanity seemed to disappear?
I think it was a long-term process that started many years earlier before. First of all, I mean, there were attacks on refugee shelters before Cologne, but I think what drastically changed was the way that closet racists were suddenly coming out. There was another event that sort of set the mood for what is happening now. Thilo Sarrazin, which he's a prominent member of the Berlin SPD, a social democrat, and a former member of the board of directors of the Deutsche Bundesbank. He released this book called Deutschland schafft sich ab.
Yes, no, I remember it well.
Which basically means Germany abolishes itself, where he claimed that Turks and Arabs are taking over Germany because they have a higher birth rate, and you know, he even racialized really deeply by saying, you know, because of endogamy in those cultures, they're genetically inferior material. So there wasn't any outcry there that you have against the AfD. Even the Bild-Zeitung, well, not even the Bild-Zeitung, but the Bild-Zeitung, which is seen as the, you know, the iron fist of the German mainstream media, who basically gives the light about what people have to think, basically published excerpts of his book. And so people were saying, I mean, of course he's a bit too extreme, but he's pointing out to a very real problem. So when you have a structure of discourse where multiculturalism is basically seen as failed, then, you know, the way to all sorts of culturalized interpretations of what happened in Cologne is you know, it's okay. Just over there.
Leandros, let's move on now and discuss. We discuss the mainstream, the far right, the reactionary cultural currents in German society. What is the state of the left? The party of the Left Party, Die Linke, was effectively formed out of the base of the old East German ruling party, the PSD, and later merged with radical elements within the old West Germany, getting probably its most sensational recruit when Oskar Lafontaine, a major leader of the German Social Democratic Party, decided to break with social democracy and join the left. And the party has had its successes. But at the same time, given the scale of what is going on in Germany, you somehow feel that it is getting marginalized. Is this a correct impression?
I wouldn't exactly call its current state marginalization. I would call it something like a very dangerous state of stagnation. Die Linke has remained more or less stable around 8 or 9% for the past 3 or 4 years. It's of course it's all very pleasant news to, even, you know, if it's not 5%, but, you know, at the same time when you have the AfD at 12%, it means that somewhere, somehow, Die Linke is not doing something right. The collapse of Syriza in Greece has had a major impact on the way people of Die Linke view things, because it was you know, you had the collapse of a whole paradigm of rolling back austerity through European institutions and having a social monetary union based on solidarity. Everything collapsed. So whereas before Die Linke could claim that, you know, at least in Greece things are happening and we are here to pick up the mantle, now there's this kind of confusion.
Before we move on from that, even before the Syriza experiment turned sour and collapsed effectively with the capitulation of Tsipras to the EU, Troika, even before that whole experience, there was a feeling amongst many people I spoke to in Germany that the desire of the dominant faction within Die Linke to stay with the Social Democrats on a local level meant that they were aligning themselves with a party which was getting more and more discredited instead of breaking out for independence. And one often got the feeling that Gregor Gysi, the Die Linke leader, and his faction would like nothing better than to be integrated on some level within the ruling structures of the German state.
Yeah, well, of course, Die Linke, as you pointed out before, was always a contradictory formation. A lot of the cadre who came from the PDS, from the East German part, are, you know, their whole slogan in the 90s was, "We want to arrive in the Federal Republic." And it's sort of understandable because, being in the PDS in the 90s, you were shunned from the media. You were seen as this kind of disease that had to die out. You were seen, people were asking, East Germany does not exist anymore. Why do you exist? So, but, the PDS very cleverly, I think, took advantage of the failures of reunification in the East and established itself. So this, of course, influences. I mean, Gregor Gysi is, he was an important personality of Die Linke, but it's not just Gregor Gysi, and it's not just people from the East. This is what people, I think, a lot of times tend to overestimate, is that you have all these Eastern people who are very, reformist and all those Western radicals, but even a lot of the people who broke from the SPD, maybe not Lafontaine, but some other people, they were very left-wing social democrats, but they were social democrats. So there is this desire, of course, I'm talking about the time before the current refugee crisis, when Merkel seemed dominant, where you had Merkel being this kind of uniting figure that has saved Germany from the Euro crisis. The whole dilemma of Die Linke, not just of the right wing, but also of the left, was how to break the hegemony of Merkelism. And one easy answer is, of course, to say that we need to take the best people from the SPD, mobilize them, take the best people from the Greens and network with them and try to push them towards a new social, ecological, governmental project that breaks with, the sort of neoliberalism we have seen, something like saving capitalism in order not to implode, like Varoufakis is basically saying. And the problem with a lot of the left within Die Linke is that the debate on how to go forward was being conducted on a very programmatic basis. Because Die Linke has a very radical party program. And they were basically just saying, the program is the best, we only have to convince people. And this has led to, I would say, maybe an introvert kind of culture of just discussing among yourselves instead of going out to society. And meanwhile, other people like the AfD are going out to society. So I think it's a very tough dilemma, and I think that Die Linke really now has to find an adequate way to deal, to confront what is going on with the seeming primary contradiction between right-wing anti-European populism on the one hand and the so-called liberal and economically liberal elites. This is where it gets tough, and I think this is where the answers of Die Linke on this current subject have been lacking in depth and substance, and this goes for many wings, not just from the right.
Time is short, Leandros. Let me discuss one other issue. I know it's a huge issue, but we will discuss it very briefly. That in Germany and German political culture now, because it wasn't exactly the same in the 60s and 70s, it is virtually impossible to discuss the oppression of the Palestinian people and what the Zionist regimes in Israel are doing to them. Now, in the 60s and 70s, it was possible to discuss it, and within the German left, the SDS, there was a very strong wing of pro-Palestinians. Today, that is virtually impossible, and Die Linke itself has shied away from discussing the subject. I remember speaking in Tübingen and a few other places where I raised the question of the BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, and there was complete horror. No, you can't discuss this here. They'll say the Germans are putting signs above our shops again. So I understand all that it goes very deep, this feeling of guilt. But ultimately, the current generations cannot be blamed for the Third Reich. What is at the root of it?
The emotional factor of guilt is something that certainly plays a part. I don't want to diminish that. But I think that people in Germany are actually much more ahead than their politics. I'm talking about, there was a survey conducted a couple of years ago which basically said that, you know, the majority of the German electorate is critical towards Israeli policies, and the majority of those critical is not to be found in the
political
right wing,
system,
but it's among the voters of Die Linke foremost, the Greens and the SPD. So, the majority of those critics, you know, base their opposition to Israeli policies or the criticism on a, you know, humanist, universalist basis.
of course.
And on the other hand, you have those who are anti-Semitic. They also tend to be Islamophobic, and they also tend to be more right-wing. So I think it's a bit, you know, it's very easy to say that it's just skill, but I think that in the political system, you know, this ideology of the new anti-Semitism has become, in Germany especially, sort of like something that the elites proudly wear, in order to basically boost their kind of moral credentials in their quest to, you know, have Germany becoming a great power again without frightening anybody.
Yeah, I must point out that, of course, it's not only Germany. The situation in France,
yes, of course,
is worse in some ways, where it's illegal to argue in favor of BDS or have demonstrations in favor of the Palestinians. In Britain, new restrictions are being put on BDS, and there's a huge demand in the United States to outlaw it. Yeah. So one can't blame the Germans alone. But I'm just saying that they are particularly sensitive, which the present generation has no need to be. And the fact that a vast majority of people supporting Die Linke and the SPD and the Greens understand this is good, but it's not reflected inside the parties.
Yes, it's also sort of irrational if you think about it. But I think that in the next couple of years, this thing will inevitably change. I don't want to sound too optimistic or anything, but I think what is going to change it and what is already changing it on the ground is not exactly, you know, Die Linke having a program which is 100% anti-imperialist, because Die Linke might have people who say these things, but it's constructing alliances on the ground. So, and I think this is one of the reasons why this situation was enabled in the last 20 years, is that you didn't have an internationalist-based solidarity movement with the Palestinian people. It had collapsed 20 years ago. I know that time is short, but I think that a lot of people in the German left think that who can we support, you know, in some conflict. And they do not tend to look at the issue of oppression first, but they tend to look who are we ideologically related to.
And that's difficult.
And, well, if people were honest, they would see that it's not difficult, because there are a lot of progressive activists, not only on the Palestinian side, but also on the Israeli Jewish side,
yeah.
Who are basically imploring the German left to change its position. But I think what can change things, and what is already partially changing things, like in a city like Berlin, which has large Arab communities, it also has a very large Israeli expat community of around 30,000. And, well, I wouldn't say most of them, but a significant minority of those Israelis are very left-oriented, are working together. So it's very difficult to discredit demonstrations happening which are co-organized as somehow Islamist or anything. So I think that this sort of examples point the right way, the right direction. And, you know, I have a friend of mine, Israeli economist who is in the BDS movement. He basically said that, you know, in South Africa, before the apartheid fell, the whites were very racist and radically right. The moment the apartheid fell, everybody said they were against it all along. And I think this sort of moment cannot be excluded in Germany, because, you know, things can happen.
Jan Ross, very good talking to you.
Thank you very much for having me.